The morning the will was read aloud, Eleanor Whitcomb stood at the back of the cold library at Harrogate and counted the seconds between the solicitor's words and the moment the room would turn against her. She had learned to count things. The number of stairs between the kitchen and the nursery. The number of coins in the housekeeping tin. The number of mornings since her father had been put into the frozen ground beneath the yew. Now she counted the held breaths of her late father's relations, arranged in their black crepe along the window seats, as a man she had not seen in 3 years read out that the estate, the unentailed 5,000 acres of it, the house, the rents, the whole of the Harrogate fortune, passed not to any of them but to her. A fan stopped moving. A throat cleared. From the long settle near the fire, her father's cousin, by marriage, Lady Marjorie Vane, set down her teacup with the precise click of a woman placing a stone upon a grave. To the room, Eleanor was a problem now made suddenly enormous. She had been the quiet daughter, the plain one, the girl who had nursed an old man through 2 winters of failing lungs while the rest of them stayed warm in town. She had been nothing, and now she was everything, and the room did not like it. Stay with me through this one. Because what the world decided about Eleanor Whitcomb in that library was not the last word, and the man who would prove it wrong had not yet walked through the door. She did not know him yet. You will come to... What none of them said aloud, though it moved beneath the black silk like a current beneath ice, was that a fortune, in the hands of an unmarried woman of 24, was a fortune waiting to be taken. They did not need to say it. Eleanor had grown up among these people. She knew the shape of their thinking the way she knew the drafts in the corridors. And she knew that before the spring was out, someone would come for what her father had left her, wearing a clean cravat and a kind smile. And she would have to decide how much of herself to surrender to keep the rest. She had not expected it to be him. To understand what came after, you have to go back to a single afternoon, 3 years before the will was read, to a garden party at Wexford, where Eleanor had been 17 and foolish and certain that kindness was the same as safety. There had been a young man there, newly come into his title, the Earl of Ravensmere, whose name was Julian Hart, and whose face she had thought, in the way of 17, to be the most serious and the most beautiful she had ever seen. He had spoken to her twice. The second time he had told her, in front of 3 other people, that he had no intention of marrying a girl with neither connection nor conversation, and that she ought not to look at men so far above her station as though they might look back. She had not wept. She had walked the length of the garden with her chin level and her hands folded, and she had not let a single one of them see what the words had done. She had, instead, carried the sentence the way one carries a splinter too deep to draw out. To the world after that afternoon, she had decided she was exactly what he had named her. Nothing worth the looking. What she had not known, and what she would learn far too late to spare herself the months between, was that he had not meant a word of it. That he had said it because his uncle had been standing 6 feet away listening, and his uncle held the whole of the Ravensmere debts in his fist, and a single sign of softness toward a girl with no money would have cost Julian the one thing he had left to protect. That explanation, though, belonged to the future. In the garden there had only been the words, and the splinter, and the long walk to the carriage. Now her father was dead, and the fortune was hers, and the Earl of Ravensmere was a widower of 30, with an estate bleeding money into the ground, and a small daughter he did not know how to speak to. He had buried his wife 18 months before. The marriage had been arranged by the same uncle to the same purpose, and Julian had stood at the foot of a sick bed and watched a gentlewoman he had never managed to love die of a fever he could not pay the best physicians to fight, and he had decided, with the cold clarity of a man who has run out of soft choices, that he would never again let tenderness stand between himself and survival. End quote. When the news of the Whitcomb will reached him in his study at Ravensmere, where the rain came through a corner of the ceiling, no money had been spared to mend. He did not think of the garden. He thought of the rain. He thought of his daughter's outgrown boots. He thought of the 5,000 acres, and the rents, and the girl he remembered as a quiet thing in a plain gown, and he thought that here, at last, was a problem with a solution, and the solution was a wedding. He told himself she would be grateful. A woman in her position, unmarried, unprotected, with vultures already circling, would be glad of an earl's name to stand between her and the Lady Marjories of the world. He told himself it was nearly a kindness. He did not let himself remember what he had said to her in a garden when she was 17, because a man who is about to do a hard thing cannot afford to remember the soft ones. The courtship, if it could be called that, began 6 weeks after the funeral. He came to Harrogate in a coat 3 seasons old, brushed until it nearly looked new, and he sat in her drawing-room and spoke to her with a correctness so complete it was nearly cruel. Eleanor received him because Lady Marjorie had installed herself as Eleanor's chaperone the moment the will was read. And Lady Marjorie did not refuse an earl. He spoke of the weather, and the roads, and the difficulty of the spring planting. He did not speak of the garden. Eleanor sat with her hands folded and waited to discover what he wanted, because she had learned that men of his rank did not call upon women of her plainness without wanting something, and she had stopped expecting the wanting to be flattering. It took him 3 visits to come to it. On the third, with Lady Marjorie pretending to doze by the window, he set down his cup and said, in the level voice she would come to know better than her own heartbeat, that he had a proposal to put to her that was a matter of business, and ought to be heard as one. He had an estate and a name and a daughter who needed a mother. She had a fortune, and no protection, and a house full of relations who meant to take what was hers. A marriage between them would solve both difficulties. He did not pretend to an affection he did not feel. He thought her too sensible to want him to. "You wish to marry me for my money," Eleanor said. She had not meant to say it so plainly. It had simply arrived. The way the truth sometimes did when she was too tired to dress it. Something moved in his face, very fast, and was gone. "I wish to marry you for our mutual advantage," he said. "I will not insult you by calling it anything else." To the room, had the room been listening, it would have looked like the coldest sort of bargain. Eleanor, though, who had spent her whole life reading the small print of other people's faces, saw the thing he had not meant her to see. She saw that he had flinched. She told herself it meant nothing. She was wrong about that, as she was wrong about a great many things that spring, but the flinch lodged in her the way his words once had, and she did not forget it. She should have refused him. Every sensible part of her knew it. A man who came to her purse with that face and that history was a man who would take and call it a bargain. And yet, Lady Marjorie had begun, in the careful way of such women, to speak of Eleanor's cousin, Mr. Sinne. Crail, who had let it be known that he considered the will a grave injustice and meant to contest it, and that a woman alone could not hope to stand against a man's claim in the courts, and that Mr. Testa. Crail had hinted he might be persuaded to drop the matter were Eleanor to become his wife instead. Mr. Crail was 40, and damp-handed, and had once kicked a spaniel in front of her for the crime of being underfoot. Between the Earl, who wanted her money without pretending otherwise, and the cousin, who wanted her money, and her body, and her silence, Eleanor chose the one who at least did her the courtesy of honesty. She accepted him on a Tuesday, in the rain, with no one but Lady Marjorie and the solicitor to witness it. She did not feel chosen. She felt like a parcel that had been weighed and found, after all, to be worth the postage. The wedding was small and cold, and over in 20 minutes. She came to Ravensmere as its countess in the same plain grey travelling gown she had worn to her father's burial, because she had not thought it worth the money to buy new, and she stepped down from the carriage into the courtyard of a great crumbling house, and looked up at the rain-stained stone and understood that she had married into a poverty grander than her own had ever been. The first person to greet her was not her husband. It was a child, a small girl of perhaps 5 years with her father's dark, serious eyes and a pinafore that had been let down twice at the hem, who stood at the foot of the great staircase with a wooden horse clutched against her chest and stared at Eleanor with the frank, assessing gaze of the very young. Her name was Beatrice. Her nurse had told her a new mother was coming. and she had come down to see whether the word meant anything she could trust. Eleanor knelt down on the cold flags of the hall, heedless of the gray gown, and looked at the wooden horse instead of at the child because she had nursed enough frightened things to know that a frightened thing cannot bear to be looked at directly. "He is a fine horse," she said. "What is his name?" The child considered her for a long moment. "He does not have one," she said. "Papa says I am too old for naming horses." "I do not think anyone is too old for naming horses," Eleanor said. "But it is a serious business, and ought not to be rushed. Perhaps we might think on it together." Behind her in the doorway, the Earl stood very still and watched his new wife kneel on his cold floor and speak to his daughter as though the child were a person and not a problem, and something in his chest, which he had spent 18 months teaching to stay quiet, made a sound he did not recognize. He had married her for the money. He repeated it to himself like a prayer. He had married her for the money, and the money would mend the roof and pay the debts and keep his uncle from the door, and what the woman did with his daughter in the meantime was no concern of his. He told himself that for a great many weeks, the trouble was that he kept finding reasons to be in rooms she was in. The marriage settled into a shape neither of them had quite expected. Eleanor did not weep or rage or retreat to her rooms, as he had half feared a disappointed woman might. She rose early. She walked the house and the grounds and learned the names of the servants and the state of the accounts, and within a fortnight she understood the Ravensmere finances better than Julian had ever troubled to, because Julian had inherited a habit of not looking at things that frightened him, and Eleanor had inherited nothing but the habit of looking. She found economies in places no one had thought to look, in the candle accounts and the coal and the price the kitchen had been paying for fish, a full third above the market. She found a steward who had been quietly robbing the estate for years, skimming the rents and the timber sales and the repairs that were charged for and never made, and she found him out, not with accusation but with a column of figures laid gently on the desk, in her own neat hand, with the discrepancies set side by side where a child could read them. The man blustered. She said nothing at all. She only let the column sit between them in the lamplight, and watched him understand that a woman who counts does not need to raise her voice, and the man was gone by the end of the week, and the rents came in whole for the first time in a decade. She did all this without once asking Julian's leave, and he discovered to his considerable discomfort that he did not mind. He had expected to resent her competence. Instead, he found himself watching her cross the courtyard with a ledger under her arm and her plain skirts kilted up out of the mud, calling instruction to a workman about the mending of the stable roof, and he found that the watching was not unpleasant, and that this was a problem he had no column of figures to solve. The first time he understood he was in danger, it was nothing he could have named to another soul. It was an ordinary evening. He had come into the small parlor to find Eleanor reading aloud to Beatrice by the fire. Some foolish tale of a horse who crossed a kingdom to find his boy, and the child was asleep against her side. And Eleanor read on anyway, softly to the sleeping child, because she had not the heart to stop. She did not know he was in the doorway. The firelight was on her face, and her voice was low and warm and entirely unguarded in a way he had never once seen it. And Julian stood in the dark of his own house and felt the careful structure he had built around his heart shift on its foundation like a house settling after rain. The child's small hand had curled into a fold of Eleanor's skirt, and Eleanor had laid her own hand over it without seeming to notice she had done so, the way a person breathes. There was a smudge of jam at the corner of Beatrice's sleeping mouth that no one had troubled to wipe, and a worn place on the arm of the chair where the nap of the velvet had gone. And the fire ticked and settled in the grate, and the foolish horse crossed his foolish kingdom in Eleanor's quiet voice, and none of it was anything, and all of it together undid him. He had thought grief had taught him the worst the heart could do. He had not known that, watching a woman be gentle to a child who was not her own, in a room she had no reason to love, could open a man along a seam he had believed long since sealed. He went to bed that night and did not sleep, and in the morning he was colder to her than he had been since the wedding, because a man who has felt the ground move beneath him reaches first for the wall. Eleanor noticed the coldness and read it through the old splinter. As confirmation, He had what he wanted. The money was his to manage now, the debts were being paid down, the roof was mended. She had served her purpose, and a purposeful man had no further use for warmth. She told herself she did not mind. She had not married him for warmth. She had married him to keep Mr. Blank. Crail in the courts from the door. And that bargain was being kept, and she would be a fool to want more from it than she had paid for. The body, however, keeps its own accounts, and Eleanor's body had begun to keep one she could not balance. She was aware of him in a room before she saw him. When he handed her down from the carriage, the place where his gloved hand had held hers stayed warm long after he had let go. At dinner, the length of polished table between them seemed to her both a vast distance and no distance at all. And she found herself watching the candlelight on the hard line of his jaw, and the way his mouth softened, very slightly, only. And ever when Beatrice spoke to him, and she hated herself for the watching, and she watched anyway. By the time the season called them to London, Eleanor had stopped pretending to herself that what she felt for her husband was indifference. She had not the slightest hope it was returned. That, she thought, was the cruelest arithmetic of all. To have married for safety, and to have wanted against every scrap of sense she possessed. To be loved. London was where the trouble waited, and the trouble had a name, and the name was Julian's uncle. Lord Ashcombe was the sort of man who had spent 60 years arranging other people's lives to his own profit, and had never once been told no, in a manner he could not punish. He had held the Ravensmere debts over his nephew's head for a decade. He had chosen Julian's first wife, and grieved her death chiefly as a lost investment. And he had a plan for the Whitcomb fortune that did not include leaving it in the hands of a sentimental young wife who had begun, he heard, to spend it on roofs and orphaned tenants and the schooling of servants' children, instead of on the things that mattered. He had come to London to take the fortune in hand, and he had brought with him the instrument by which he meant to do it. The instrument was a document. Lord Ashcombe had spent a portion of the spring with a clever solicitor of flexible principles, and between them they had drawn up a settlement that, had Julian signed it in the first careless week of his marriage, as Ashcombe had urged him to, would have placed the whole of Eleanor's fortune under the uncle's control, in all but name, to be administered for the family's benefit, which was to say for Ashcombe's. Julian had not signed it. He had meant to. He had carried it in his coat for a fortnight after the wedding, and every evening he had taken it out to sign it. And every evening he had found a reason to wait, and the reason, though he would not name it even to himself, had been a child asleep, against a woman's side, and a voice reading on in the dark. Now Ashcombe wanted it signed, and he had grown impatient, and impatient men make their threats plain. At a dinner in a great house off Grosvenor Square, with 30 people seated along a table dressed in silver and hothouse roses, Lord Ashcombe leaned toward his nephew over the soup and said low, that it was time the boy remembered who had kept him from the debtor's gate, and that a wife was a wife, but a family was forever. And that the document would be signed before the week was out, or the loans would be called in, and Ravensmere would be sold over the heads of the Earl and his sentimental Countess, and his ill-dressed brat alike. Eleanor, seated 4 places down between a deaf admiral and a bishop's wife, did not hear the words. She saw her husband's face, however, and she had spent 3 months learning to read it. And she saw the thing move across it, that had moved across it in her drawing-room when she had said, "You wish to marry me for my money." She saw him flinch, and she understood with the cold clarity of a woman who has been waiting her whole life for the other shoe, that whatever bargain she had thought she was keeping, there was a second bargain beneath it that she had never been shown. She found out the shape of it 2 days later, and she found it out cruelly, because that was how such things were always found out. Lady Marjorie Vane had come up to London for the season, and Lady Marjorie had her sources, and Lady Marjorie had never forgiven Eleanor the fortune. At a crowded morning call in a drawing-room full of women with sharp ears, with Eleanor sitting not 8 feet away, Lady Marjorie let it be known, in the carrying voice of a woman who wishes to be overheard, that it was the saddest thing in nature to see a plain girl so taken in. That everyone knew the Earl of Ravensmere had married the Whitcomb money, and never the Whitcomb girl. That there was a document drawn up to hand the whole of it to old Ashcombe, and that the only question remaining was whether the new countess was a fool or merely a convenience. The room went very quiet. The quiet was the kind that listens. Eleanor sat with her teacup halfway to her mouth and felt the blood leave her face, and was aware, distantly, of every eye in the room arriving upon her by degrees, the way frost arrives upon a window. She set the cup down without a sound, and the small click of the saucer seemed to her, in that listening quiet, as loud as a dropped glass. She did not weep. She had learned long ago in a garden how not to weep where they could see, and the lesson held now as it had held then, though it cost her more. A woman beside her murmured something kind and unbearable about the weather. Another studied her over the rim of a cup, with the bright, patient attention of a person watching to see whether a wounded thing will bolt. Eleanor felt each gaze as a separate weight and bore them all, and the only sign of what it cost her was a faint whiteness about the mouth that none of them occupied with their own appetite for her ruin. Thought to read. She rose. She thanked her hostess for a charming morning in a voice pitched exactly to carry no tremor. She made her farewells to the circle of sharp faces one, by name, with a correctness so complete that it left them nothing to feed on, and she walked the length of that drawing-room with her chin level and her hands folded, and not one of them saw what the words had done. She went home to the rented house in Henrietta Street, and she went up to her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed in her good dark gown, and she looked at the wall for a long time. He had married her for the money. She had always known it. He had told her so himself, plainly, and she had thought herself so clever for choosing the honest taker over the dishonest one. And yet there had been a document. There had been a plan. There had been all along, beneath the level voice and the correct manners, a machinery built to take from her even the small power her father had meant her to have, and her husband had been part of its building. The flint she had treasured up like a coin meant nothing. A man could flinch and sign all the same. She did not yet know that he had not signed. Julian came home at dusk to a silent house, and a wife who would not look at him, and he knew within a minute of crossing the threshold that something had broken while he was out. He found her in the small upstairs sitting room, very upright in her chair, the unlit candles around her, and she told him in a flat, clear voice exactly what she had heard and exactly what she had understood by it. And she asked him, when she had finished, only one question. She asked him whether the document existed. He could have lied. The lie was right there, easy and smooth, and it would have bought him time. He looked at her white face and her folded hands, and the place at her side where a child was not, this evening, asleep. And he found that he could not. "It exists," he said. "My uncle drew it up. He has been pressing me to sign it since the week we married." "And? Have you signed it?" "No, but you mean to." "No," he said, and the word came out of him with a violence that startled them both. He had not raised his voice in that house once. "No, I will not sign it. I have never meant to sign it. I have carried the cursed thing in my coat for 3 months, and I have not been able to make my hand do it. And I have told myself 100 lies about why, and I am done telling them." Eleanor looked at him. The old splinter was in her, and the new wound over it, and she did not yet trust the thing rising in her chest, because the last time she had trusted a kind word from this man, she had spent 3 years learning to be nothing. "You told me you married me for my money," she said, "in my own drawing room. You said you would not insult me by calling it anything else." "I lied," Julian said. "Not about the money. God knows, we needed the money. I lied about it being all. I told myself it was all because the alternative was to admit that I had ruined something 3 years ago in a garden, when I told a frightened girl she was not worth looking at, and that I had thought of her face every season since, and that when your father's will was read the first thing I felt, before the relief, before the calculation, before any of it, was that I might at last be permitted near you, I could not say that. A man does not say that to a woman he has wronged, so I said the money. It was the coward's truth, and I am ashamed of it. The candle stayed unlit. The room was nearly dark. Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and felt the careful structure she had built around her own heart shift on its foundation, and she did not answer him because she did not yet know whether she could afford to believe him, and the not knowing was its own kind of grief. He did not press her. He did the thing he always did when he did not know how to be soft. He gave her a command, dressed as protection. "It is late," he said. His voice level again. The rawness folded back away. "You have eaten nothing since morning. I will have something sent up. Sit by the fire. You are cold." And he lit the fire himself, kneeling at the hearth in his good coat, and he sent for soup and bread, and he stood by the door while she ate as though he could keep the whole of the season's cruelty out of the room by the simple act of standing between her and the door. Eleanor ate because she was told to, and watched him over the rim of the bowl and understood that whatever he had done, the man currently guarding her door with his body was not a man who had ever meant to rob her. The understanding did not mend everything. It lit something, though the way he had lit the fire, small and real against a great deal of dark. What neither of them knew was that Lord Ashcombe had not come to London to be refused, and a man accustomed to arranging lives does not abandon the arrangement merely because his instrument has developed a conscience. He had a second plan, as such men always do, and the second plan did not require Julian's signature at all. It required only that the marriage be shown to be a sham, that the Countess be exposed as a woman married under false pretenses and abandoned in all but name, so that her own relations, the damp-handed Mr. Neame, Crail chief among them, might be encouraged to revive the contest of the will on the grounds that a fraudulent marriage was no marriage, and that in the confusion of the courts a great deal of money might find its way into the hands of the man positioned to manage it. To do this, Ashcombe needed a public scene. He needed the whole of the season to see the Earl of Ravensmere humiliate his low-born wife, or be humiliated by her, in a manner no one could afterward pretend had not happened. He chose the Hartfield ball. It was the largest of the late season, the one all the world attended, held in a great pillared house ablaze with 1,000 candles, with an orchestra in the gallery, and the terrace doors thrown open to the warm June dark. And he laid his ground carefully. He saw to it that Mr. Crail was invited. He saw to it that Lady Marjorie was primed. And he saw to it, by a quiet word to a hostess who owed him money, that the rival was placed exactly where she would do the most damage. The rival was a Miss Honoria Pelham, a diamond of that season, gold-haired and gowned in ice blue, and possessed of a fortune nearly the equal of Eleanor's own, whom Ashcombe had spent a month persuading that the Earl of Ravensmere's regrettable marriage was a thing that might yet be set aside by a clever woman with patience, and that an earl, freed of an inconvenient wife, would be a very great prize indeed. Miss Pelham believed him, because she had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice for any man, and she had never once been the thing a man chose against his interest. She came to the Hartfield ball to begin the setting aside. Eleanor came to the ball, because to stay away would have been to confirm every word Lady Marjorie had spoken. She wore for the first time in her life a gown that had cost real money, a thing of deep green silk that Julian had quietly commissioned, without telling her, and had laid in her room with no note, and she had nearly not worn it, and then had worn it precisely because she would not let them see her flinch. She came into the great pillared room on her husband's arm, and felt the attention arrive upon her the way it always did. The assessing, the dismissing, the deciding, and she kept her chin level, and her hand light on his sleeve, and did not let the room see that her heart was going like a hare's. It began within the hour Miss Pelham, lovely and certain, contrived to be always near the Earl, to lay a gloved hand on his arm, to laugh at a height calculated to carry, to speak of times and places that excluded his wife by implication. Lord Ashcombe, moving through the crowd like weather, dropped his quiet words where they would spread, and Lady Marjorie, near the terrace doors, said to a circle of listening women, loudly enough for the third time that season and the cruelest, that there stood the Whitcomb money in a green gown, and that everyone knew the Earl could scarcely bear to look at what he had bought, and that it was only a question of time before he stopped pretending and a proper match was made. The words reached Eleanor across the floor. She saw the circle of faces turn. She saw Mr. Crail, damp and smiling, begin to drift toward her through the crowd, with the air of a man come to collect on a debt. She saw Miss Pelham's gloved hand upon her husband's sleeve, and she saw her husband's face, and she waited with the whole of the cold patience her life had taught her, to learn at last, and in public, what Julian Hart was made of. He removed Miss Pelham's hand from his sleeve. He did it gently and completely, and he set the young woman a clear step away from him with a small bow that was perfectly correct and entirely final, and then he turned from her as though she had ceased to exist, and he crossed the floor. He crossed it in front of all of them. He crossed it past his uncle, who put out a hand to stay him, and was ignored, past Mr. Dett. Crail, who stopped where he stood, past Lady Marjorie, whose voice died in her throat, and the room understood that something was happening, and the orchestra played on into a spreading silence, and 1,000 candles burned, and every face in that great room turned by degrees like frost upon a window, to watch the Earl of Ravensmere walk the length of the floor. To his low-born wife, he stopped before her. He took her gloved hand in both of his, there where every soul in London could see it, and he raised it, and he did not kiss it, like a courtesy. He held it against him, at his chest, over the place where the document had ridden in his coat for 3 months, and he looked only at her. The room held its breath. Eleanor held hers. "You are the only fortune I have ever wanted," he said. It was not poetry. It was barely above a whisper. The room, though, had gone so silent to listen that the words carried to the pillars, and Lady Marjorie heard them, and Mr. Macon Trest. Crail heard them, and Miss Pelham heard them, and Lord Ashcombe, 6 feet away, heard them, and understood in a single cold instant that his instrument was broken past mending, and his plan was ash. Because a marriage cannot be shown a sham when the husband claims the wife before all the world in a voice that shakes. Eleanor stood with her hand held against her husband's heart, in a room full of the people who had spent the spring deciding she was nothing, and she felt the old splinter, the one she had carried since she was 17, work its way at last to the surface and out. She did not weep. She turned her hand within his, instead, so that her fingers closed around his, claiming him as plainly as he had claimed her, and the gesture went round the room like a struck bell. Lord Ashcombe left within the quarter hour. He understood, as such men do, the precise moment a thing is finished, and he did not stay to be seen losing. Miss Pelham, to her credit, recovered with grace, and married a baron before Michaelmas, and was by all accounts the better, for having once been chosen against. Lady Marjorie found that her cruelties, repeated now too often and disproved too publicly, had begun to cost her the very invitations she lived for, and she retired to the country to nurse the conviction that she had been ill-used. Mr. Johnsher Crail, finding no fraudulent marriage to contest and no countess in need of rescue, took his damp hands and his grievance elsewhere, and the will stood, and the fortune was Eleanor's, to do with as she and her husband together saw fit. The next morning, before they left London, Julian did one more thing. He took the document out of his coat, the settlement his uncle had drawn to take her fortune, and he laid it on the breakfast table between them, and he put a candle to its corner, and they watched it burn to nothing on a silver dish, while Beatrice, who had been allowed down to breakfast as a treat, asked with great interest whether they were permitted to burn papers whenever they liked, and Julian told her gravely that they were not, that this was a particular paper, and Eleanor laughed, the first full laugh he had ever heard from her, and the sound of it did something to his face that Beatrice noticed and filed away in the manner of children. They went home to Ravensmere in the long gold light of the year's turn. The roof was mended now. The tenants' cottages had new thatch. The steward's books were honest. And the house that Eleanor had come to in a borrowed grey gown, expecting nothing, received her back in green silk, as its mistress in truth, and the rooms that had been cold seemed to her, that evening, to have been only waiting for someone to light them. That winter, the first snow came early. Eleanor stood at the window of the small parlor with Beatrice's hand in hers, watching it come down over the park where the yews stood black against the white, and behind them the fire was lit, and her husband sat with a book he was not reading because he was watching his wife and his daughter at the window. And on the low table beside him stood a small wooden horse that had at last, after long and serious consideration, been given a name. They had named it together, the three of them, on an evening much like this one. The child had chosen Marigold for no reason any adult could discover, and the name had stuck, and the horse stood now in the warm room as though it had always belonged there. Beatrice pressed her nose to the cold glass and asked whether it would snow forever. Eleanor said that it would not, that nothing did, that the snow would melt and the spring would come, and the horse chestnut by the gate would put out its sticky buds again as it did every year. The child considered this with the gravity she gave to all important matters, and then she leaned her whole small weight against Eleanor's side, the way she had once leaned only into a story read by firelight, and Eleanor held her, and felt her husband's eyes upon them both, and did not. She had counted things her whole life, the stairs, the coins, the held breaths of a room deciding against her. Standing at the window with the snow coming down and the fire at her back, and the small warm weight of a child against her side, she found that she had stopped counting, and that the stopping was the thing she had been waiting for without ever knowing its name. Julian came to stand behind them at the glass. He did not speak. He put one hand on his daughter's dark head, and the other at the small of his wife's back, and the three of them watched the snow fill the park where the old trees stood, and the wooden horse kept its patient watch on the table by the fire, and the house held them all, warm and lit, and no longer waiting against the long white quiet of the coming dark. If Eleanor's winter moved you, stay a moment before you go, and think of someone the world once decided not to see. The seeing, when it comes quietly. It comes like snow,